I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility
This is a love story.
without the help and support of the woman I love.
But it is not the love story we've always thought it was. Wallis Simpson, Duchess of Windsor, was a sensation. To some, the Scarlet Woman who lured Edward VIII from his throne. To others, one half of the 20th century's greatest romance. A woman and a man who sacrificed everything for each other. But hidden away in an English attic, an extraordinary and revelatory cache of secret letters and diaries has been discovered that transforms the story of Wallis and her loves.
I wake up in the night sometime and hear your footsteps coming down the passage of the flat, and there you are, with the Evening Standard under your arm.
This startling find shows that just before Edward's abdication, Wallis Simpson was desperate to avoid marrying him and planned to escape.
I've decided to go away, perhaps forever. I cannot tell H.M.
It proves that the divorce which allowed Edward finally to marry Wallis was an illegal collusion.
I am letting Wallis divorce me, of course. Please destroy this.
And it reveals that Wallis ended up spending her life with the wrong man and cast adrift from the man she truly loved, to whom she was still writing secret letters of love 2 years after she married Edward.
What can I say? When I am standing beside the grave of everything that was us, I can only cry as I say farewell, and press your hand very tightly, and pray to God, Wallis.
This long-buried treasure trove of documents, newly discovered by Wallis Simpson's latest biographer, Anne Sebber, contains one incomparable find. 15 intimate letters written by Wallis herself, around the time of the event that sent shockwaves through Britain.
December the 10th, 1936, one of the most momentous days in the history of England.
A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor.
This bundle of 15 letters took my breath away when I first read them. The fact that they'd been written at all was extraordinary. It was truly mind-blowing.
The first of the new Wallis letters was written 46 days before the abdication.
Okay, so this says Felixstowe on the postmark, 25th of October, so that's 2 days before she was due to appear at Ipswich Assizes for her divorce from Ernest Simpson.
Sunday, October the 25th, 1936. A middle-aged woman returns to a house she's renting in Felixstowe, not far from Ipswich, in a car belonging to Edward VIII. She's been the King's mistress for the past 2 years. She should be savouring the prospect of divorce from her husband and marriage to the King who so desperately loves her. But she's not. Wallis Simpson is frightened and lonely and would do anything to get out of it. At this moment, she picks up her pen and chooses the unlikeliest possible shoulder to cry on.
And here she is writing to Ernest Simpson, the man she's divorcing. I really can't concentrate on...
I really can't concentrate on anything at the moment, my dear. I've had so much trouble and complications with everyone. Also, I'm terrified of the court, etc. I feel small and licked by it all. I can't think what sort of mess I'm leaving for. I'm sorry for myself, I'm sorry for the King. I hate stuffy British minds, and last but not least, I don't understand myself, which is the cause of all the misery. Give me courage. 2:15 Tuesday. Love, Wallis. I'm so lonely.
Goodness me, her loneliness just shouts out to me because, of course, she was terrified. And who does she turn to in all this? She turns to Ernest, the man she's trying to divorce. Of course, she's not meant to be communicating with the man she's meant to hate because of his adultery.
2 days later, at 2:15 p.m, Wallis Simpson arrived at Ipswich Assizes for the divorce hearing she was so afraid of. The divorce was splashed across American and European newspapers. The British press was staying silent. But those in the know felt sensation in the air. Edward, it seemed, was on the road to marrying an American divorcee.
I was 7 years old. My father and my mother were very much involved in the whole abdication affair, you know. And so, I mean, it was just a constant conversation from morning till night, as I remember.
The day after the divorce hearing, Wallis returned to London, to the house the King had rented for her. From there, she could only watch as events counted down at a bewildering pace. On November the 3rd, Edward, still to his people the dashing young monarch just 10 months into his reign, performed the state opening of Parliament. But all he could think about was marrying Wallis.
Edward was just frankly besotted. I don't think anything was going through his mind except how wonderful she was, how beautiful she was, how much he loved her, and how much he was perfectly sure all the British people would love her the moment they got to know her.
His dream was that he should be crowned with Wallis Simpson by his side as the Queen.
But to Edward's Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, the prospect of Queen Wallis was abhorrent. She was a twice-divorced American interloper.
Baldwin knew that from the point of view of the British people, she was unacceptable. So he saw this was going to be quite impossible, and one way or another it had to be stopped.
The Prime Minister and King were on collision course. For the first time, abdication loomed. On the last day of November, the Crystal Palace, home of the triumphal Great Exhibition of 1851, burnt down, perhaps in deference to the coming self-immolation of a king. That same day, the new documents reveal a second astonishing letter from Wallis Simpson to Ernest, the husband she'd just been to court to divorce. It shows she was planning to escape from the King's clutches.
It's Wallis writing with the Wallis signature on the side, Monday.
Ernest, dear, I shan't be able to see you after all, for which I'm very sorry, but I've decided to go away sometime this week. I cannot tell H.M. I'm going because I know what would happen, so I'm really simply telling him the old search for hats story. I shall stay safely away until after the coronation, or perhaps forever. One cannot tell.
So she is desperate to get away and get out of it, and she knows that the King won't let her, so she's going to tell him that she's just going to go to Paris to buy some more hats, hoping that he'll swallow that old story. She's obviously used that one before.
Please rest assured that the things in the house will all be returned to you.
The house she's referring to is a house that the King had rented for her, which had become a nightmare prison for her because the photographers, the US press, were camped outside, and she couldn't even go out to have her hair done or her nails. The sort of routine that had become hers had been denied her now. So what a mess she had landed herself in.
The next day, before she could make her getaway, the story of Wallis and Edward's affair finally broke in the British press. The British people recoiled.
Double divorcee who's got involved with the king and who the king's going to try to marry. I mean, it was an absolute unbelievable horror.
Wallis was the rabbit in the headlights. Edward rushed her to his retreat in Windsor Park. and arranged for her to be driven to France. He assigned one of his staff to guard her.
Wallis had wanted to get away herself, but now she was in the king's hands. She'd lost control of her own situation. She couldn't choose any longer where she could go. So it was a terrible time. The king was absolutely beside himself losing Wallis. There were tears in his eyes as he said goodbye to her.
And it was his last very emotional dinner. And poor little man, one has to sympathise for him. There he was with the woman he loved going out of his life, only temporarily, as he was certain, but still leaving him abandoned, surrounded by his enemies as he saw it, in a hostile nation. It was, for him, a very black moment.
It was a hair-raising journey. The king not only lent his Buick, but also his chauffeur, and the chauffeur realised very soon that he was actually being followed. Wallis was cowering in the back with a blanket over her head, hoping she wouldn't be recognised. I mean, in 1936 we don't think of paparazzi, but that's exactly what happened.
2 days later, December the 6th, Wallis arrived at the Villa Louviers in the hills above Cannes. In letters and phone calls, she pleaded with Edward to remain king and not to abdicate just to marry her. He refused to listen.
He had to have her, to know that he had her, and know that he was going to keep her. And the only way of ensuring that, in his mind, was to get married.
But Wallis was more desperate than ever to avoid marrying Edward. She made a last-ditch attempt to escape the hangman, drafting a note to the British government which simply read,
"With the deepest personal sorrow, Mrs. Simpson wishes to announce that she has abandoned any intention of marrying His Majesty."
She tried very genuinely to get out of this situation, but it was too late. The king was never going to let her.
I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility.
To the outside world, Wallis had got her man. But for her, the abdication was a disaster. She was facing a life sentence with Edward.
Of the woman I love.
And even more unbearably, during these weeks of turmoil, she'd begun to understand that the one man she truly did love was the man she was divorcing, her husband Ernest. How on earth had Wallis made such a monumental error?
Now we all have a new king.
On December the 10th, 1936, King Edward VIII's mistress, Wallis Simpson, who was now taking refuge in the south of France, listened to his abdication speech. She wept, not for him, but for herself.
God save the king.
For the next 4 months, she and Edward could not be together, as that could be seen under 1930s law as evidence that they'd illegally colluded in Wallis's divorce. Edward, now the Duke of Windsor, took refuge in Austria, pursued by the world's press. Wallis was isolated and frightened. And as her newly discovered letters reveal, the person she chose to seek comfort in was the man she was divorcing. And the person she blamed for her predicament was the man she was now fated to marry.
Saturday, Louviers, Ernest. None of this mess and waking emptiness is of my own making. It's the new Peter Pan plan.
Peter Pan, of course, is the reference to the king that she and Ernest had between them. And obviously, they had many times discussed how the king was this child who would never grow up.
I miss you and worry about you. Oh dear. Wasn't life lovely, sweet and simple? Wallis.
As Wallis sat trapped in her French villa, there was plenty of time to reflect on an extraordinary 8-year partnership with the husband she was leaving, and all too late, realizing she loved. She'd first met Ernest Simpson 10 years before in New York. He was half American, half English, and had fought for Britain in the First World War. He'd become, to every inch, the officer and gentleman, still fondly remembered by his family.
Well, he was just a nice person to us as his great-nephews. He was an extremely nice, kind uncle. As far as we were concerned, he was almost the sort of fairy godfather.
For Wallis, the fairy godfather arrived at just the right time. She was separated from her first husband, Win Spencer, an American naval aviator whom she'd married when she was just 19. Marriage had seemed the escape from her childhood home in Baltimore, where life had been hard. Her father died when she was a baby. She and her mother were left dependent on rich in-laws.
Later in life, Wallis's mother became a paid hostess at a club. It was really a very tough life, and she was absolutely determined that she was going to have security, and that, for a woman in Wallis's position and time, of course, had to come through a man.
Ernest, too, was married, but Wallis used her wiles to get him.
She focused on somebody. She made it her business to listen. It's the eye contact, partly. It's making a man feel that he's the most special person in the world.
Ernest and Wallis divorced their respective spouses, and in 1928 married. Wallis wrote to her mother,
"I'm very fond of him, and he's kind. I can't go on wandering for the rest of my life."
In earnest, Wallis had found the security she so craved. They moved to London, bought a flat, number 5 Bryanston Court, and set out to climb society's ranks. Through a mutual friend, Wallis got to know a guaranteed ladder to the very top, Lady Thelma Furness, the mistress of Edward, Prince of Wales.
Edward was still in the popular view. A heroic figure. He was a dashing young prince. He was handsome. He was supremely well cut out to be the monarch. Everyone assumed that he would one day get married, settle down, have children, and ensure a succession. He was perfect.
In January 1931, Wallis and Ernest were invited by Thelma's sister to a country house party in Leicestershire. There, awaiting, was the world's most dashing and desirable bachelor.
He was completely different to any of the rest of the family before him. I mean, George V, for example, his father was, you know, absolutely stiff, regal, all this. And here's a boy wearing a peaked cap, smoking, winking, you know, which was fine until the mid-30s. But then, you know, by this time, suddenly he wasn't quite as young as he had been, and the winks didn't come off quite as easily as they used to.
By this time, those people closest to him were getting a bit more doubtful. It was fairly clear to them that he was frivolous, irresponsible, not really prepared to do a serious job of work.
Edward took a liking to Wallis, and she and Ernest became frequent guests at his weekend retreat, Fort Belvedere in Windsor Park. Then, in January 1934, Thelma Furness had to go to America.
Wallis had made herself very friendly with Thelma Furness. They often had lunch at the Ritz and talked about all sorts of things. And on one of these lunches,
Thelma Furness, somewhat rashly, suggested to her friend, Wallis Simpson.
Will you look after the little man, as he was known?
And she kept a very good eye on him indeed.
And, of course, she writes to her Aunt Bessie about this because it's very exciting to have the Prince of Wales drop by at Bryanston Court.
I think I do amuse him. I'm the comedy relief, but I always have Ernest hanging round my neck, so all is safe.
And when Thelma came back and there was another lunch together,
she suddenly saw the Prince of Wales pick a lettuce leaf off his plate, and playfully Mrs. Simpson sort of slapped his hand. And
everything was different. Thelma picked that up immediately with this one gesture.
And her eyes met Mrs. Simpson's.
And clearly, Wallis had become the prince's girl.
That summer, Edward invited Wallis to join his holiday party in the south of France. One guest observed that he followed her around like a dog.
When the whirlwind of Wallis hit him, he was completely without defences. He had nothing to fall back on inside himself at all.
At the end of that summer holiday, the prince slipped a velvet Cartier pouch into Wallis's hand containing a diamond and sapphire charm.
And over the years, she accumulated an astonishing fortune in precious stones and elegant objects, which he laid at her feet as a tribute to her supernatural powers.
My mother, and I think like so many other people in society, did think that she was a little gold digger.
Ernest Simpson, left behind in the London flat, was delighted with Wallis's royal foray. He joked that she had been into the realm of Peter Pan's Neverland. He was also doing nicely from the royal connection.
The story is that the Prince of Wales had some tweed specially woven for him, out of which he had made an overcoat. And my great-uncle, Ernest Simpson, is said to have very much admired it. And the Prince of Wales said, "My dear chap, you know, there is some tweed left over. You may have it." And so Ernest did, and he had an overcoat made up, which you can have a look at in due course, which is exactly the same as the one that the Prince of Wales wore. And there is, of course, slightly rude family story saying that he actually swapped his wife for an overcoat.
Rather more usefully, Edward opened the door for Ernest to join his Masonic lodge, with its entree to his rich friends. Wallis and Ernest were playing as a team for their own enjoyment and profit. The game of royal mistress had a clear set of rules which required Ernest's participation.
It's perfectly all right to have affairs for gentlemen to have affairs with married ladies, not girls, only married ladies.
You see, Wallis wouldn't have been asked by herself to do anything. She would always have had to have her husband with her.
People knew that there was an affair with somebody going on, you know, and they would put them at next-door rooms in the country house weekends and that sort of thing. That was fine. But it was just the way things looked. It was the outside show that counted, and appearances had to be maintained.
I imagine people did exactly the same with Camilla.
Wallis understood the nature of the game better than anyone. She reassured her Aunt Bessie.
Everything will go on just the same as before, namely the three of us being the best of friends. I shall try and be clever enough to keep them both.
She was utterly convinced that a newer, younger model would come along and the prince would tire of her. And then she would need Ernest as her safety net. And Ernest was quite happy to play along with this.
In the meantime, Wallis and Ernest were going to make hay. Royalty opening up undreamt of treats. Among the cache of new documents found by Wallis Simpson's biographer, Anne Seber, is a revealing collection of letters written by Ernest to his mother back in America, recording the good times.
April the 16th, 1935. My dearest one and only mother, the Prince took 2 other married couples and ourselves to the Grand National Steeplechase near Liverpool. He had a special car on the train, and we were met by a fleet of motors. We lunched in state with Lord Sefton, the owner of the course, and had a splendid view from his private stand. It was great fun. Much, much love, in which Wallis joins, and a big hug. Affectionately, Ernest.
But around this time, a tiny shadow began to hover over the happy triangle. Edward was showing an intensity of passion that was alarming. He started writing Wallis extraordinary love letters couched in a private, childlike language.
Most of us, if our early love letters were revealed to the public, would be slightly embarrassed. This was an exceptionally virulent case. It was sickening, the infantile babishness of the correspondence.
He talks about a boy and a girl. He talks about them in the third person. A boy loves a girl more and more. He talks about when we will be one, we being their initials, Wallis and Edward. And of course there's a pun on the royal we involved in that as well. Wallis, although she responds and she writes as if she's in love, it's not the same sort of passionate outpouring as you see in his letters to her.
Edward's obsession with Wallis had become overwhelming. Why has long been a mystery.
Love. I mean, nobody's ever explained love. You fall in love. He did, in spades.
And you can talk about love being mad. Love was an obsession for him, and he became blinded by this love.
He thought she was Helen of Troy. Nobody else did. I mean, she had a face like an old boot, we thought, and very, very austere and lantern-jawed, and even at the age of 23, when it didn't turn much to turn me on, she didn't. She was always said to have picked up one or two little tricks while she was in China, which greased the wheels rather spectacularly. But she didn't awake his virility. I mean, he'd had lots of girlfriends before. She was funny. She was far more intelligent than he was. She was extremely witty with the sort of the American wisecrack remarks, you know.
I think what really appealed was that she treated him with a disrespect, almost a contempt, which no English girl could possibly have done. However independent-minded, however strong-minded, he was still the future king. Mrs. Simpson didn't give a damn about the fact that he was a future king. She thought this was an absurd anachronism, and she treated him like dirt, and he loved it.
It was almost as if the worse she behaved, the more he needed her. And she could sense that. So this gave her a sort of license to behave really badly, but he wanted her more and more. I suppose if one's looking to explain this, there's something in their relationship that he craved forgiveness, so that the moment of forgiveness was actually sublime.
This relationship was easily visible when in 1935 Edward again invited Wallis to join him on summer holiday in the south of France.
She only had to lift a finger and he'd do exactly what she said. I mean, you know, it was too easy. He was a little boy.
Wallis ran the house, organised the menus, and sent bossy little notes to Edward, or David, as she and his family called him. He lapped it up.
David, I didn't see a green vegetable on the menu. Sorry to bother you, but I like everyone to think you do things well. Perhaps I'm quite fond of you. David, I think it would be nice to have the Churchill drinks on the porch outside the drawing room. I also think you're a very nice boy.
This summer holiday was Wallis's longest period of separation yet from her husband, Ernest. He went to America on business and visited Wallis's Aunt Bessie. Wallis wrote ahead to her aunt.
Ernest will give you an outline of our life in London since royalty arrived. He thinks it all a great joke, and so it is.
But unknown to Wallis, for Ernest, the joke was beginning to wear thin. Earlier in the year, Wallis had invited an old school friend, Mary Kirk, to London to keep Ernest company while she cavorted with Edward. Mary's marriage was falling apart, and she was at a loose end.
So Wallis thinks, I know, I'll ask Mary over. Mary'll entertain Ernest. That'll keep Ernest happy.
Mary and Ernest had got on well. Now in New York, they met up again and began an affair. Wallis knew nothing of it. Ernest remained Mr. Dependable. Just before his return from America, she wrote to Aunt Bessie,
"I shall be glad to see that angelic Ernest again. Everything the same here, and too many invitations appear. What a bump I'll get when a young beauty appears and plucks the prince from me. Anyway, I am prepared."
But storm clouds were gathering over Wallis in a way she could never have foreseen. It was not just the entry of Mary. There was about to be a seismic change in Edward's life. Just before midnight on January the 20th, 1936, George V died. Edward, Prince of Wales, was now King Edward VIII. He was also head of the Church of England, which not only disapproved of divorce, but would not allow divorcees to remarry in church.
He knew that he must marry Wallis Simpson. He knew that he was destined to be king. He hadn't quite brought those two things together. Suddenly, his father has died, he was on the throne, and the two things were together. He had got to make up his mind how to play it and to take immediate action on something which up till then had been deferred, deferred, and deferred.
Edward's mistress, Wallis Simpson, assumed that his duties and status as monarch would soon eclipse their relationship. She couldn't have been more wrong.
The high and mighty Prince Edward Albert Christian George.
Amazingly, his need for Wallis increases. Wallis finds it a suffocating need, actually. He's almost paralysed as king, almost unable to do anything without her there.
From the very first, even as a newsreel camera accidentally caught Wallis and Edward together watching his proclamation as king, he wanted her at his side. She wrote to Aunt Bessie,
"I've had to be at the new king's beck and call. He's lonely and needs companionship and affection, otherwise he goes wrong. Ernest has, of course, been marvellous about it. He has the makeup of a saint and much too good for the likes of me."
By spring 1936, Edward was more obsessed than ever with Wallis, and determined to marry her. His adoration put Wallis at the very peak of society.
The hostesses believe, as is indeed the case, that if they get Wallis, they have access to the king. So this is a very exciting moment for her.
At the same time, Wallis's husband, Ernest Simpson, was tiring of being the wallflower. He asked Edward man to man if he intended to marry Wallis. Edward replied, "Do you really think I would be crowned without Wallis at my side?" That evening, Ernest agreed to make way for Edward and divorce Wallis. Then, in May 1936, Mary Kirk, Wallis's oldest friend with whom Ernest had begun an affair, invited herself to stay at Bryanston Court. Matters came to a head. There was an ugly scene in the Simpson flat.
Wallis was absolutely furious and accused Mary of seducing Ernest. I mean, that is rich, since she had set this whole thing up. And Mary immediately packs her bags, leaves Bryanston Square, and never speaks to Wallis again. That's the end of it.
At this moment, Wallis made her fateful decision. She would submit to Edward's demand that she divorce Ernest and take the biggest gamble of her life.
You see, I am 40, and I feel I must follow my own instincts as regards my life, and am quite prepared to pay for a mistake.
She very much believes this is her last chance to achieve something, and maybe, just maybe, she could be Queen Wallis, and that actually everyone would pay attention to her and life would be fantastic, and she would have achieved the unthinkable.
Ernest agreed to the customary way of securing a divorce. He would be caught staying at a hotel with another woman to produce evidence of adultery. Ever since, that woman has been known as a Miss Buttercup Kennedy. But among the cache of new documents is a secret diary by Mary Kirk, which shows it was her. Mary wrote that she was Wallis's scapegoat.
Wallis really did manipulate her. And reading Mary Kirk's diary, it's clear that Wallis now was on a slippery slope. This is the Faustian pact that Wallis had made. She was really using people. She did things like invite Mary to the opera, and then at the last minute, Wallis didn't turn up, and she would say to people, "You see, Mary's having an affair with my husband. She goes to the opera with him, and I can't go." So she was really not only manipulating people, but she was treading on people. She was absolutely using them for her own ends.
Though Mary blamed everything on Wallis, Ernest, in one of the newly discovered letters to his mother, made it clear that Edward, not Wallis, had destroyed their marriage.
It is a great pity, as we were really so frightfully congenial, and never had an unhappy moment together until the mess started. I am letting Wallis divorce me, of course, and the case will probably be heard in October. Wallis, of course, is not asking for any alimony. Please destroy this.
There was every reason to destroy the letter. It would have proved that those involved had colluded in the divorce, which was illegal.
There was a genuine risk that somebody would try to bring forward evidence of complicity, which would in fact therefore have disallowed the divorce.
Wallis was away on her third summer holiday with Edward, cruising along the Dalmatian coast. But the fun was almost over. The Narlin cruise would have a devastating twist. On the way home, Wallis stopped over in Paris. Waiting for her were sensational American press cuttings and photographs sent by Aunt Bessie, showing her intimacy with the king.
It suddenly came to her just what she was letting herself in for, how enormous the scandal was going to be, and how her whole life was going to be changed.
And she then writes to Edward a very articulate letter.
I must really return to Ernest for a great many reasons, which please be patient and read. The first being that we're so awfully congenial and understand getting on together very well, which is really an art in marriage. I'm sure you and I would only create disaster together. I want you to be happy. I feel sure I can't make you so, and I honestly don't think you can me. Goodbye, we all say. Wallis.
The effect on Edward VIII was dramatic.
He responded by threatening to slit his throat if Wallis left him.
He made it quite clear that he could not contemplate for an instant the possibility of separation. He said he would kill himself.
Well, of course, Wallis recognised that there was no way she could have blood on her hands. There was no going back.
In October, Wallis moved to her rented house in Felixstowe to await her divorce hearing. Ernest moved out of their flat in Bryanston Court and went to live in the Guards Club in Mayfair. From there, he wrote Wallis a letter which, despite his affair with Mary, showed where his heart still really lay.
I think something in me quietly died when I closed the door of the flat for the last time this evening. I have no tears left to shed. I know that somewhere in your heart there is a small flame burning for me. Guard it carefully, my darling, and don't let it go out, if only in memory of the sacred, lovely things that have been. Some day, I pray God will fan it into a blaze again and bring you back to me.
From Felixstowe, Wallis wrote back, with the divorce hearing flashing in front of her like a knife.
Give me courage. 2:15 Tuesday. Love, Wallis. I'm so lonely.
Wallis was trapped. The countdown to abdication and a lifetime saddled to Edward was underway.
And to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do.
Edward VIII had abdicated. But there were still months to go before the decree absolute for Wallis Simpson's divorce could come through, and they could be together. Wallis was hiding out in the south of France. But as her newly discovered letters show, it was not her future husband Edward she wanted to be with, but Ernest, the husband she was divorcing.
I miss you and worry about you. Wallis.
While Wallis was so missing Ernest, Ernest was now coming to terms with their separation. He wrote to Wallis that she'd gone too far with Edward to turn back.
I want you to believe, and I do believe, that you did everything in your power to prevent the final catastrophe. And you may rest assured that no one has felt more deeply for you than I have. And would your life ever have been the same if you had broken it off? I mean, could you possibly have settled down to the old life and forgotten the fairyland through which you had passed? My child, I do not think so.
Ernest, more than anyone, understood Wallis's turmoil and the empty future she faced with the exiled king. He wrote to his mother,
I cannot see much happiness ahead for those two poor people who have made this mess. What will their life be?
While Wallis awaited that future life, she wrote again to Ernest. It is perhaps the most poignant letter of all.
Thursday, February the 16th. Ernest, dear.
Ernest, dear. Life here is one colossal bore. I don't go places, and I think it more dignified to be quiet. One hopes to keep the name from the papers. But even doing nothing is no protection from their intentions. I wake up in the night sometime, and think I must be lying on that strange chaise longue, and hear your footsteps coming down the passage of the flat, and there you are, Evening Standard under your arm. I can't believe such a thing could have happened to two people who got along so well. At least it never should have been like it is now. Write me sometimes, please. And above all, make your life again, with care. You are so good and sweet. My dearest love to you, Wallis.
But for Ernest it was over. He knew that a completion of the divorce was the only answer, and as he told his mother, it couldn't come too soon.
Frankly, I'm in no way anxious to see the divorce upset. I don't see how I could ever live with Wallis again. All the nice things are spoiled. And I don't want to be tied for life to someone I cannot live with.
Just 2 days later, news came through that the decree nisi for Wallis and Ernest's divorce would be granted. Wallis moved from Cannes to a new base, the Château de Condé in the Loire Valley. Edward was allowed, at last, to join her there. On May the 12th, 1937, came the coronation, not of Edward VIII, but of George VI. On this great day, from her place of exile, the man Wallis chose to write to was Ernest.
Dear Ernest, how exciting London must be today. If only one was starting with 2 brushes and a pail, Wallis.
3 weeks later, on June the 3rd, Edward and Wallis were married. Not one member of the royal family attended.
He thought at least his brothers would come. He thought at least Lord Mountbatten would come and be best man. And one by one it became clear that none of them were coming. And the saddest blow of all, when even his closest friend, the man who had escorted Mrs. Simpson to the south of France, Lord Brownlow, said that he at last realised it was incompatible with his role as Lord Lieutenant to come. And so in the end he was left with a handful of fairly inconsiderable hangers-on and a rather dismal little ceremony. It was a sad moment for somebody who had only a few months before been King of England.
Wallis had always hoped that there would be an element of an alternative coronation, but it wasn't like that at all. Constance Spry had come out to do amazing flowers, far too amazing for the small number of people that were there. Cecil Beaton had taken some beautiful photographs. But there's a chilling emptiness about the whole wedding. Yes, Wallis looked beautiful in her main bochet, Wallis blue outfit, impossibly slim hips, this sort of halo-like hat. That's the defining image of this great romance. But there's a coldness about the whole thing, with only a few people there, a handful of people there.
In November 1937, Ernest married Mary. Wallis continued to miss him. Well over 2 years after the marriage to Edward, she wrote again to him, admitting that her pride, as she put it, had pushed her over the cliff.
Anyway, I shan't write about it again. It is painful, and it is too late. Wherever you are, you can be sure that never a day goes by without some hour's thought of you and for you, and again in my Eden prayers at night. With love, Wallis.
And this seems to be the last letter in the series, and there really isn't another letter after this in 1938 where Wallis writes to him in this vein. She is closing this chapter.
Ernest and Wallis were embarked on their new and separate lives. Ernest's would bring early sadness. Mary was diagnosed with cancer and died aged 45. Ernest married again. This, his fourth marriage, lasted happily till his death. Wallis and Edward's marriage lasted till Edward's death in 1972. She made the best of it, projecting an image of her and Edward as the happiest couple in the world.
She was good. You sat next to her, which I did much, much later in my life, several times in Paris after the war. She was good company. If you find yourself sitting next to him, which, thank God, I very seldom did, it was a nightmare. He had absolutely no conversation, and he led just an incredibly bored life.
He had sacrificed so much that he must, from time to time, have wondered about that sacrifice. And as he trailed wistfully around behind her, sort of 3 feet behind, looking rather disconsolate while she went from shop to shop, one would think thoroughly bored. It did seem a pretty ghastly life, but I think even though it was a pretty ghastly life, his life without her would have been still ghastlier, and that he was happy in this kind of slavery in a way which would have seemed inconceivable to anyone who knew the role which he could never still be playing in London.
Wallis lived on till the age of 89. Much was talked of duty in the story of Wallis and Edward. In the end, Edward failed to do his duty to his nation. But Wallis, in sticking with him till the day he died, did hers.
I think it's a lesson in be careful what you wish for. I think Wallis recognised that this was a situation she would have to live with, and for the next 36 years, she did live with it, with some nobility. One can admire her for that.
20 years later, he was totally doted on her, dependent on her. If she was at a dinner table and got up and walked out, he would, within 2 minutes, he'd be rushing after to find out what was going on. He was obsessed by her.
Wallis was never obsessed by him. She did have a love in her life, but it was not Edward.
I think what the new letters show is that what for so long has been perceived as the greatest, most romantic love story of the century, is actually not the love story we think it is. The real love story, which is revealed from these letters, is Wallis's love for Ernest, a man who could really offer her not just security, but security and happiness and well-being, which ultimately she realised was a quieter and deeper sort of love and worth much more than the empty life, the boredom, albeit the excitement briefly of jewels and fabulous clothes, but having to live with a man whom she privately ridiculed.
Saturday, October 30th. Ernest, dear. What can I say? When I am standing beside the grave of everything that was us. Only, oh my very dear, dear Ernest, I can only cry as I say farewell, and press your hand very tightly, and pray to God, Wallis.